There comes a moment, quiet, unannounced, when your soul whispers a truth too loud to ignore. This is not worth the war inside me. It's not dramatic. It's not loud. It's not a grand declaration thrown across a table or texted in anger. No, it's the soft severing that happens in the privacy of your own mind. When you decide that peace is worth more than proximity, we often grow up learning that loyalty is the highest virtue, that staying in relationships, no matter how draining, is a sign of love, of maturity, of strength. But what if the bravest act is to let go, not out of hatred, but from a deep reverence for your inner harmony? This is not about selfishness. This is about choosing sanity over chaos, truth over pretense, healing over repetition. So today, I want to explore what really happens deep inside when you choose your peace over any relationship. There is a profound and often invisible moment in life when the soul, weary and suffocated beneath the weight of someone else's demands, finally whispers no more. This is not a dramatic declaration shouted across a room, nor is it the sudden shattering of what was once a meaningful connection. It is quieter than that, far subtler. It is the internal shift when a person reclaims something sacred, their inner authority. For too long, many of us live as if we are guests in our own lives. We adjust our tone to soothe another's insecurity. We suppress our instincts to avoid discord. We mold our truth to fit someone else's narrative, hoping, perhaps unconsciously, that this performance will earn us love, acceptance, or simply a moment of peace. And in doing so, we slowly exile our authentic self, not because we are weak or unaware, but because we have learned, often from childhood, that safety comes from compliance. But this borrowed peace, this false harmony, has a cost. It is the kind of cost that doesn't show up in your bank account, but in your nervous system, in the tightening of your chest when you see their name on your phone, in the way your voice hesitates before speaking freely, in the way your body feels after every interaction. Depleted, agitated, unsettled. This is the soul's way of speaking through the body, of saying, "You are not at home here." To choose peace is not always to walk away physically, at least not at first. Sometimes it begins with a much quieter act of resistance, the refusal to keep betraying yourself for someone else's comfort. This is the beginning of reclaiming inner authority. It is the decision to stop handing your emotional well-being over to those who do not know how to hold it with care. It is the realization that no relationship, no matter how long it has lasted, no matter how intertwined your lives have become, is worth the erosion of your self-respect. There is a woman I remember vividly. For 15 years she remained bound to a friendship that wore her spirit down inch by inch. There were no dramatic betrayals, no explosive arguments, only a persistent undercurrent of criticism disguised as concern, manipulation disguised as loyalty. She had been trained over time to second, guess her feelings, to shrink in the presence of her friend's ego, to believe that love was something she had to earn by sacrificing her joy. When she finally stepped back, after years of internal conflict, she said something I'll never forget. "I didn't know how heavy it was until I put it down." That is the nature of psychological bondage. We normalize the burden until it becomes part of us. We carry it not because we want to, but because we've forgotten what it feels like to walk freely. When she released that friendship, what she regained was not merely time or energy, it was herself. She began to speak differently, to stand taller, to reconnect with parts of her identity that had been lying dormant beneath layers of suppression. This is what it means to reclaim authority, not to control others, but to return to the truth of who you are without apology. Of course, this process is rarely without consequence. Choosing your peace may cost you the approval of others. It may make you the villain in someone else's story. People who once praised your selflessness may accuse you of being cold, distant, ungrateful. But this is merely a reflection of how much they benefited from your silence. When you stop allowing others to drink from your emotional reservoir without consent, you may find yourself alone, but you will not be empty. You will be full of something far more enduring, integrity. This choice to prioritize peace is not an escape from responsibility. On the contrary, it is the deepest form of accountability. It is saying, I will no longer make others responsible for my happiness, nor will I make myself responsible for their inability to regulate their own emotions. It is a stance that requires maturity, clarity, and, above all, courage. For when you stop asking others to decide your worth, you begin to face the terrifying freedom of deciding it for yourself. Psychologically, this act is transformative. It signifies a shift from the external locus of validation to an internal one. You no longer chase after love like a beggar at the gates. You become the architect of your own belonging, and in doing so, you begin to magnetize relationships that reflect your wholeness rather than exploit your wounds. Those who only loved the version of you that served their convenience will fall away, but those who recognize the full spectrum of your truth, your fire, your flaws, your silence, your strength, will remain. Or perhaps they will arrive for the first time. In analytical terms, this is the journey of individuation, the process of becoming whole. It is not the same as becoming perfect, or even becoming happy. It is becoming real, and realness, by its very nature, disturbs those who rely on illusion. When you reclaim your inner authority, you threaten the dynamics that were built on your compliance. This is why it often feels so difficult. The psyche clings to the familiar even when it hurts, because the unknown is always more frightening than the pain we understand. But when you dare to move beyond that fear, you create space for something new, not just within your life, but within your very self. There will be moments after you make this choice when you question yourself. You may miss the connection, even if it was toxic. You may grieve the role you played, even if it left you invisible. You may sit in silence, unsure if you were right. That is part of the healing. Let yourself feel it. Let yourself mourn not just the person, but the version of you that believed you needed them to survive. And then, slowly, you'll begin to notice something else. A steadiness inside you, a quiet knowing. You'll begin to recognize yourself in the mirror again, not as someone fractured by compromise, but as someone whole, even in their imperfection. You'll laugh more easily, breathe more deeply, sleep without the heaviness of invisible negotiations, and perhaps most beautifully, you'll begin to create from a place of authenticity, not to prove anything, but simply because it feels good to be alive. This is not a destination. It is a way of being, a way of walking through the world where your inner compass becomes your guide, a life where you no longer sacrifice your peace on the altar of someone else's dysfunction, a path where you, finally, choose you, and that changes everything. There is an eerie, almost sacred silence that follows the decision to choose peace over a relationship that has long undermined your spirit. In that silence, you begin to hear echoes that were always present but perpetually drowned out. The sighs of your soul, the whispers of your intuition, the cries of a self that had long been waiting for acknowledgement. For the first time, perhaps in years, you begin to feel what you once numbed, not because you lacked sensitivity, but because you had become far too good at surviving. Emotional survival teaches us to minimize pain, to rationalize cruelty, to paint over wounds with humor, responsibility, or the ever convenient excuse That's just how they are. We don't realize we're hurt when we are too busy adapting. The human psyche has an uncanny ability to normalize dysfunction. It's a mechanism of defense, to remain in environments where love is inconsistent, where attention is a transaction, or where criticism masquerades as concern. One must construct narratives that justify the chaos. We tell ourselves they didn't mean it. We say they're just stressed, or that it's our fault for being too sensitive. We frame volatility as passion, detachment as strength, and invalidation as tough love. We don't call it abuse or neglect. We call it family or romance or friendship. And thus the wound festers under layers of denial. But choosing peace is the first act of disobedience to this unconscious agreement. It is the moment when the soul, weary from contortion, refuses to twist any longer. In stepping away, something miraculous and terrifying happens. The fog begins to clear, and with that clarity comes the truth, not just about others, but about what you've endured in silence. The protective stories you once repeated to yourself no longer soothe. The little compromises that once seemed harmless now reveal their cumulative cost. The laughter you used to disguise your discomfort rings hollow in your memory. You begin to see not only how deeply you were hurt, but how deeply you convinced yourself that you weren't. A man once shared his story with me. He had lived for decades under the shadow of a brother who ridiculed him under the guise of bonding, who belittled his accomplishments with backhanded compliments, who erupted with anger when challenged but expected grace when he wounded others. For years, this man believed he was weak for feeling hurt. He believed family meant endurance, not choice. He told himself that loyalty meant swallowing his voice to protect another's ego. But when he finally stepped away, when he stopped answering the calls, stopped showing up to gatherings that left him hollow, he experienced something strange, grief, not just over the relationship, but over the years of dimming his own light. I finally stopped telling myself I was overreacting, he said. I saw how I had dimmed my light just to avoid his shadow. That statement holds the weight of years, years of psychological dissonance, of feeling something was wrong but lacking the permission to name it. Because when we're inside the chaos, we don't call it pain, we call it normal, and so the healing cannot begin. We cannot treat a wound we refuse to see, but peace, that gentle reclamation, shifts the landscape of the psyche. In the absence of chaos, your nervous system finds rest. In the absence of invalidation, your thoughts begin to take form, and in that space, emotions that were once compressed and dismissed begin to rise. Anger, sadness, confusion, regret. They emerge not to torment you, but to be seen. This is the first true act of healing, to look upon your pain and say you are real, to stop shaming yourself for being affected, to recognize that what happened to you was not a reflection of your weakness, but a testament to your strength for surviving it. Healing, however, is not instant. It is not linear. It does not arrive as a revelation, but more like a slow unfolding. You begin to replay moments and feel their true impact. The comment that once seemed like a joke now stings with its intended cruelty. The silence that once seemed benign now burns with abandonment. The patterns become clearer, how you lowered your voice, how you second, guessed your choices, how you became a chameleon to keep the peace. These are not faults. These were coping strategies. Your psyche did what it had to do to belong. But now, in the sanctuary of solitude, you no longer need to contort yourself to survive. You begin instead to expand. Part of the healing process is anger not as a force of destruction, but as a voice long silenced. It is the part of you that knew the behavior was wrong, but was told to endure. It is the part of you that felt the sting of emotional distance, but was told not to be dramatic. Anger arises not to consume you, but to defend the parts of you that were left undefended for too long. Let it speak, let it burn through the layers of numbness, let it remind you that your boundaries are sacred and your feelings are valid, and then comes sorrow, a deep, aching grief, not always for the person, but for the self you had to abandon to maintain the connection. You mourn the time spent being misunderstood. You mourn the potential lost in rooms where you could not be fully seen. You mourn the moments you needed support and instead received judgment. Grief, when honored, becomes the doorway to transformation. It clears the path for something new, not because you forget, but because you no longer carry the memory as a curse. In time, the pain lessens. It does not vanish, but it integrates. You begin to carry your history with compassion, not shame. You stop explaining your decisions to those who benefit from your silence. You stop apologizing for your boundaries. You stop needing others to understand the pain you no longer deny, and something even more powerful happens. You begin to recognize the signs earlier. You sense when energy is off. You feel the tension in your body when a connection isn't safe. You honor your intuition. You trust your perception because you've been to the depths of self betrayal, and you've learned that peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of alignment. This journey is not always visible to others. From the outside, it may look like distance, like coldness, like withdrawal. But you know the truth. You know that what appears as isolation is actually incubation. You are not disappearing. You are re-emerging, no longer fractured by compromise, but whole in your being. You are healing, not just from what was done to you, but from what you once believed you had to accept. To begin healing what you once normalized is to walk through a fire of your own making, to burn away the lies that kept you small, and to rise, not with vengeance, but with clarity. Clarity about who you are, what you need, and what you will no longer tolerate. Clarity about the kind of life you are building, one rooted in truth, resilience, and radical self-respect. In choosing peace, you did not just choose to walk away from pain. You chose to walk toward yourself. And that, in its quietest form, is an act of profound courage. There are decisions we make that appear small on the surface, quiet internal shifts that no one applauds or even notices at first. But some of these decisions are not simply choices. They are ruptures in inherited narratives. They are the breaking points of ancient, unseen chains. To choose peace in the face of generational dysfunction is to declare, silently but powerfully, this will not continue with me, and that one act, however private, becomes an earthquake that reshapes everything that follows. The patterns we inherit are often disguised as personality traits or family values. They present themselves not as burdens, but as norms, the volatile parent we excuse because that's just how they are. The need to keep the peace at all costs because conflict always led to chaos. The belief that love must be earned through sacrifice, silence, or suffering. These beliefs are not consciously chosen. They are absorbed through experience, repetition, and survival. They become the water we swim in before we even know what water is. And so we carry them forward, unaware that we are living stories that were written long before we arrived. But something happens when pain becomes too loud to ignore, when our nervous system finally revolts against the emotional dissonance we've internalized as love. We begin to question. We begin to observe. We begin to say, this doesn't feel right, even if it's familiar. That is the beginning of disruption. That is the seed of transformation. And from that seed grows a new possibility, not only for your own life, but for every life your presence touches. I have seen it unfold in countless ways. The man who learns to speak with gentleness because he grew up under the tyranny of a father who equated masculinity with rage. The woman who refuses to weaponize silence because her mother did, and she remembers the ache of never knowing where she stood. The child of addicts who becomes a counselor, not out of rebellion, but out of reverence for the pain that shaped him. These are not just personal choices. They are sacred interruptions. They are revolutions written in flesh and bone. There was a woman I once spoke with who had 2 daughters. She had stayed for years in a relationship where love was conditional, where every disagreement was met with coldness or criticism, where her value was tied to how small she could make herself. She endured it because she had watched her own mother do the same. It was, in her words, just how things were. But one day, after yet another argument that left her trembling and voiceless, she saw her daughter watching from the stairs. Just watching, not crying, not asking questions, just absorbing, and in that moment something broke. She didn't leave that night. Change rarely happens in dramatic explosions, but something shifted. Over the next few months, she started choosing herself in small ways, speaking up, setting boundaries, reclaiming space that had long been surrendered. Eventually, she walked away. There were tears, guilt, shame, fear. But there was also something else, clarity. And months later, her daughter, only 9 years old, looked up at her and said, "Mom, I didn't know you were allowed to do that." Those words are a testimony to the power of choice. That child will grow up knowing that leaving is not failure, it is strength. That love should never feel like fear, that her worth is not measured by how much pain she can endure, and she knows this not because she was told, but because she saw it, because her mother, without realizing it, became the first chapter of a new story. This is how generational cycles break, not through theory, but through action, through one person who decides that their peace is more sacred than the illusion of stability, through one soul brave enough to say, "I will not pass this on." And though the impact may not echo in headlines or ceremonies, it reverberates through time. It changes the way a child loves, the way a partner listens, the way a family heals. To break a cycle is to enter unknown territory. It is terrifying because you are walking away not just from a person or a pattern, but from a map that guided you, however dysfunctionally, through life. You will feel lost. You will question yourself. You will wonder if you're betraying the ones who came before you, but you are not betraying them. You are honoring them in the most honest way possible. You are saying, "I see what shaped you. I carry your pain. But I refuse to let it shape those who come after me." There is ancestral grief that lives in us, wounds we didn't create but inherited, and while it is not our fault, it is our responsibility. The chain may not have begun with you, but its end can. And that ending will not look like perfection. It will look like therapy sessions, like tearful conversations, like the trembling of your voice when you speak the truth for the first time, like choosing not to yell when you were taught that rage is the only language people understand, like offering yourself compassion on days when you fail. The healing of a lineage is not always glorious. It is slow, raw, and deeply human. It is you lying awake at night wondering if you did the right thing. It is you holding your child and whispering, "I will do better," even if you don't know how yet. It is you becoming conscious of the words you use, the energy you bring, the examples you set, not because you're aiming for perfection, but because you're aiming for consciousness. That in itself is a miracle, and let us not underestimate the ripples. The friend who sees you enforce a boundary and realizes they can too. The partner who learns what respect feels like because you demand it. The stranger who watches you walk away from something toxic and finds the courage to walk away from their own storm. The echo of your choice moves through the world in ways you may never witness, but they are real. When you choose peace, you do not do it only for yourself. You do it for every child who is watching, for every part of you that was silenced, for every ancestor who didn't have the chance, and for every future soul who will walk lighter because you decided to stop carrying what wasn't yours to begin with. This is how legacies change, not with a scream but with a whisper, not in the eyes of the world, but in the privacy of your heart. Not by fighting the old, but by creating space for the new. And sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is simply say, enough. There is a peculiar kind of silence that follows the decision to choose peace over a relationship. It is not the comforting silence of contentment, nor the meditative silence of spiritual stillness. No, it is a raw, confronting quiet, a silence that echoes through your bones and brings to the surface every suppressed voice within you. It is the silence that strips away distraction and leaves you alone, not just in your room or in your home, but in your very being. This is not the solitude people write about in poetry or self-help books. It is the hollow, uncertain space where the world you once depended on disappears, and you are left to face the one presence you have most often abandoned, your own. Most people are not afraid of being alone because they dislike quiet. They are afraid of the encounter that happens in the quiet, the encounter with the unhealed self, the unmet longings, the ghosts of decisions made under duress or delusion. We do not fear loneliness itself. We fear what loneliness reveals. That is why we jump from relationship to relationship, why we fill our calendars with obligations, why we stay in connections that deplete us. Because somewhere deep down we believe that emptiness is worse than pain. We have learned to see solitude as a symptom of failure rather than a path to clarity. But in truth, it is only in solitude that we begin to distinguish between what we truly are and what we have pretended to be. When you choose peace, especially from a relationship that once defined your sense of worth, you do not just walk away from another person. You walk into the unfamiliar territory of your own inner world. And it can be terrifying. The mind begins to question, did I make a mistake? Was I too harsh? What if they were right? The heart begins to ache not only for the person, but for the comfort of the familiar chaos. Even if the relationship was toxic, it provided structure. Now, in its absence, you must sit in the rubble and decide how to rebuild. But here lies the paradox. The very loneliness that tempts you to return is also the crucible in which your true self is refined. It is in this solitude that you learn not to perform, not to please, not to disappear for the sake of acceptance. You begin to see yourself, not as others have defined you, not as you molded yourself to be, but as you actually are, flawed, complex, beautiful, capable of both light and shadow. This self is not found through noise, but through stillness, not through applause, but through presence. And the more you sit with this self, the more you begin to feel a quiet reunion taking place within you. I once spoke with a young man who had spent years tethered to a woman who made him feel like he had to earn love through emotional labor. He stayed because he feared being alone. He feared that without her, he would fall into some existential abyss. But when the relationship finally fractured beyond repair and he was forced into solitude, something unexpected happened. At first, he felt the familiar pangs of loneliness, the urge to text, to seek validation, to escape his thoughts. But over time, he stopped reaching outward and began looking inward. One day he told me, I thought I needed her to feel whole. Turns out, I just needed time with the parts of me I had forgotten. There is deep wisdom in that realization. We often seek people to fill our gaps, not realizing those gaps are invitations. Invitations to meet ourselves with compassion, to parent the inner child that was once ignored, to listen to the parts of us that whisper instead of scream. Solitude becomes the setting in which these inner dialogues begin, and as you sit longer with yourself, you begin to see that loneliness is not a void. It is a mirror. It reflects back what needs healing, what has been neglected, and what longs to be expressed. This is not to say the journey is easy. There will be nights where the silence feels suffocating, where memories return uninvited, where doubt circles like a vulture waiting to consume your resolve. But if you stay with yourself, if you resist the urge to run back into familiar arms just to escape discomfort, something sacred begins to form, a new foundation, a deeper self-trust, a companionship with yourself that no one can take away. It is in this companionship that you begin to shift your desires. You stop seeking relationships to complete you and begin looking for connections that mirror your wholeness. You stop tolerating emotional crumbs because you've learned to nourish yourself. You stop begging for validation because you've begun to validate your own experience. And perhaps most importantly, you become less afraid of solitude, because you've discovered that being alone is not the same as being abandoned. From a psychological standpoint, this is the individuation process. It is the moment when the ego, no longer propped up by external roles and attachments, begins to align with the deeper self. The self does not crave approval. It does not chase after temporary affection. It knows that all true relationships are reflections of the inner one, and when that inner relationship is grounded in truth, acceptance, and care, all other relationships begin to align or fall away. Loneliness, when embraced rather than avoided, becomes the sacred rite of passage into authenticity. And authenticity becomes the ground from which real connection can grow, not the connection that arises from fear, dependency, or projection, but the kind that is rooted in presence, choice, and love without condition. In learning to sit with loneliness, you gain more than strength. You gain clarity. You see who you are without the noise, the masks, the performance. And in that clarity, you no longer settle for less than what honors your peace. To be clear, the longing for connection will still exist. We are human, and to be human is to desire to be seen, touched, understood. But the hunger shifts. You no longer seek others from a place of emptiness, but from a place of fullness. You are no longer looking for someone to save you. You are looking for someone to meet you as you are, where you are. That shift changes everything. It changes how you speak, how you choose, how you love. And perhaps most importantly, it changes how you relate to yourself. You no longer see your solitude as a prison, but as a sanctuary. You stop fearing your own company and begin to treasure it. And from that place of deep inner peace, you move through the world not with desperation, but with grace. Choosing peace often means walking alone for a while, but in that walk you find your footing. In that silence you hear your voice, and in that loneliness you meet the one person who will never leave you yourself. That is not a tragedy. That is the beginning of everything. There is an ancient truth woven into the fabric of the psyche. The outer world reflects the inner state, not as some mystical projection, but as a deeply psychological reality. What we draw into our lives is shaped, often unconsciously, by what we are willing to accept, by what we believe we deserve, and by the emotional patterns we have not yet made conscious. When we are at war within ourselves, we attract relationships that mirror that chaos. When we abandon our needs in the hope of being loved, we invite people who demand our self-abandonment as the price of admission. And when we seek validation in places where we have never been truly seen, we attract only more hunger, more confusion, and more pain. But something begins to shift when we choose peace, authentic, soul, deep peace. Not the fragile calm that depends on others behaving a certain way, but the steady inner stillness that arises when we stop betraying ourselves. In that shift, we begin to emit a different psychological energy. The patterns of desperation, overgiving, or people-pleasing no longer animate our interactions. We stop contorting ourselves to fit into stories that were never ours, and in that moment we stop being magnets for the familiar pain we've grown accustomed to. It is not magic, though it may feel miraculous. It is alignment. Peace changes what you tolerate. It resets the internal compass. Where once you may have clung to relationships out of fear of abandonment, now you begin to release those that do not serve your wholeness. Where once you may have mistaken intensity for intimacy, now you begin to recognize that true connection is quiet, patient, and safe. The familiar patterns, drama, manipulation, emotional unavailability lose their grip. Not because they have changed, but because you have. You no longer resonate with what drains you, and the world responds. What we tolerate teaches the world how to treat us. If you tolerate being silenced, you will find yourself surrounded by people who refuse to listen. If you tolerate being dismissed, those who dismiss will gather at your table. But when you begin to uphold your boundaries with tenderness and conviction, when you stop apologizing for your needs, when you walk away from people who demand your silence in exchange for their love, then, and only then, does something remarkable happen. You begin to attract people who honor your truth rather than exploit your fear. One woman shared with me her story. She had spent years in a pattern of relationships that looked different on the surface, but were emotionally identical, each one requiring her to shrink, to soften her intuition, to manage the emotions of others while ignoring her own. When the last relationship ended, she decided to do something radical. She chose herself. For 2 years she stayed single, not because she gave up on love, but because she was learning how to give love to herself in the ways she had always outsourced. She confronted the parts of herself that longed to be chosen and learned how to choose herself instead. She sat with her wounds, not to wallow in them, but to witness them, to understand how they had been shaping her desires. And then, one day, when she was no longer searching, when she was no longer hungry for the old patterns dressed in new clothes, someone entered her life. He did not ignite her trauma. He did not require her to perform. He saw her not as a project to fix or a fantasy to fulfill, but as a person, whole, flawed, beautiful in her authenticity. "You don't find your person until you find your peace," she said to me, and I believe she was right. This story is not an exception. It is a reflection of what happens when we stop betraying ourselves for the sake of belonging. The psyche is wired for wholeness. It knows when something is false. It aches when we pretend, and it rejoices when we finally stop compromising. That rejoicing may look, for a time, like solitude. It may look like long nights of questioning, of aching, of longing, but that ache is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that your system is reorienting. It is detoxing from a lifetime of familiar suffering, and in that detox there is the sacred opportunity to finally choose what aligns. Aligned relationships are not perfect. They do not promise perpetual harmony, but they do reflect back the peace you have cultivated within yourself. They challenge you in healthy ways. They stretch you without breaking you. They provide safety, not in the form of control, but in the form of acceptance. And they are built not on the sands of projection, but on the bedrock of presence. To attract such relationships, you must become willing to sit through the discomfort of not settling. You must be willing to disappoint others in order to remain true to yourself. You must resist the urge to chase or convince. You must allow yourself to be fully who you are, even if that means being misunderstood. And in that bold act of self-honoring, the world begins to rearrange itself. What once felt out of reach becomes possible, not because the world has changed, but because you have. The psychological transformation that occurs here is not merely behavioral, it is archetypal. You move from the role of the abandoned child into the presence of the sovereign adult. You stop seeking a savior and start embodying the nurturer within. The parts of you that once pleaded for love now stand in their own worth, and from this place of integration, your external life begins to mirror the peace you've cultivated internally. Choosing peace, then, is not about isolation, it is about preparation. It is about making space, not just physically, but emotionally, for something greater, deeper, more authentic. When your soul is no longer cluttered with roles you've outgrown and identities you've inherited rather than chosen, there is room for resonance, for relationships that do not simply echo your trauma, but elevate your spirit. This is the quiet revolution of choosing peace. It is not always visible from the outside, but within, tectonic plates shift, patterns dissolve, wounds begin to scar over with wisdom, and slowly, steadily, the world you once knew begins to transform. Not with fireworks, not with declarations, but with a soft unfolding, a gentle arriving of people, opportunities, and connections that no longer demand your silence, your sacrifice, or your suffering to stay. They meet you where you are because now, finally, you are willing to meet yourself. The world might never applaud you for choosing peace. There may be no ovation, no fireworks, no validation, but your body will feel it. Your spirit will expand, your nights will grow quieter, your days will feel lighter, and most importantly, you'll meet yourself again. In the end, it's not about choosing peace over a relationship. It's about choosing the kind of relationship, whether with others or with yourself, where peace is never the price. Let that be your silent revolution.